GitHub had another widespread outage this week. Agentic browsers have a vulnerability that can turn a web page into an execution path. And AWS is finally pushing certificate manager users away from email validation. This week is mostly about dependencies we treat as boring until they become the incident. I'm Brian Teller from Teller's Tech, and this is Ship It Weekly. Welcome back to Ship It Weekly, the show about the DevOps, SRE, cloud, platform, and security stories that matter when you are the person keeping the thing running at 3 in the morning. For the weekly story list and source links, check out oncallbrief.com. For past episodes and show notes, head over to shipitweekly.fm. This week, GitHub had a major outage. We have a new browser agentic vulnerability called PleaseFix. AWS Certificate Manager is ending email validation, and Cloudflare is experimenting with TypeScript native CI workflows. Then we have a quick lightning round and a human closer about what happens when policy changes far away from engineering still land directly on the people running production. Let's get into it. First up, GitHub had another widespread outage. The incident affected the website, API, actions, pull requests, issues, webhooks, authentication, and Copilot. At points, web and API error rates were around 20%, with some services reportedly much worse. The obvious takeaway is that GitHub was down. The more useful one is that GitHub is not really just a developer tool anymore. For a lot of companies, GitHub sits directly in the production path. It runs CI/CD. It holds source code. It manages pull requests and approvals. It may be part of authentication. It triggers deployments. And increasingly, AI tooling depends on it too. So when GitHub has an outage, the impact is not just that engineers cannot push code. You can lose deployment capability, change management, incident automation, and sometimes even access to the thing you need in order to fix something else. That means GitHub belongs in dependency planning the same way any other critical SaaS provider does. Can you deploy if it is unavailable? Can you roll back? Can you access the last known good artifact? Can you authenticate to the systems you need? And do your incident procedures still work if the place where your runbook lives is also having an outage? There is also a difference between being unable to ship new code and being unable to recover existing code. Those are not the same risk. Maybe it is completely acceptable for deployments to stop when GitHub is unavailable. In fact, that may be safer. But rollback is different. If your rollback procedure starts by checking out a repository, running a GitHub action, or waiting for an approval inside GitHub, then your recovery path shares the same dependency as your deployment path. That is worth testing before the outage. You do not necessarily need a second source control platform sitting around, but keeping signed artifacts somewhere independent, documenting emergency deployment procedures, and knowing exactly which parts of your recovery path depend on GitHub can make a huge difference. Developer infrastructure is production infrastructure now. Treating it otherwise is mostly wishful thinking. Next, there is a vulnerability called PleaseFix affecting agentic browsers. The core issue is that the browser is no longer just displaying content. An agentic browser can interpret content, make decisions, use tools, and take actions. That changes the threat model. A malicious web page is not only trying to trick a person anymore. It may be trying to influence an autonomous system that has access to credentials, local files, cloud services, or external APIs. That is a very different boundary. The interesting part here is not whether the model is smart enough to recognize a bad instruction. The interesting part is whether the surrounding system allows that instruction to become an action. If a web page can indirectly cause the agent to run a command, submit data, or interact with another service, then the browser has effectively become part of your execution environment. And that means the same controls we use everywhere else still matter. Scoped credentials, tool level permissions, network restrictions, human approval for sensitive actions, and a clean separation between untrusted content and privileged operations. I also think this is where the phrase human in the loop gets oversold. A confirmation dialog is useful, but if the agent controls the text surrounding that confirmation, summarizes the action for the user, or performs enough harmless looking steps before asking for approval, then clicking yes can become almost automatic. The better control is to make high-risk actions technically distinct. Reading a web page should not implicitly grant the ability to upload a local file. Summarizing an issue should not grant the ability to merge a pull request. Browsing documentation should not grant shell access. Those boundaries should exist outside the model. We keep talking about prompt injection like it is a weird AI-specific problem. A lot of the time, it is really an authorization problem wearing new clothes. The input is untrusted. The action is privileged, and there is not enough enforcement between the two. Third, AWS Certificate Manager is ending support for email validation for new public certificates. DNS validation is becoming the path forward. That sounds boring. It is also exactly the kind of boring change that breaks things months later because nobody remembers which certificate still depends on an old workflow. Email validation has always been awkward operationally. Someone has to receive the validation message. The right mailbox has to exist. The right person has to notice it. And renewals can depend on that process continuing to work. DNS validation is much easier to automate and much easier to make durable. This also lines up with another reoccurring theme from this week. Certificate expiry is still causing real outages, which is kind of amazing in 2026. Certificates are predictable. They have expiration dates. They are machine readable. And yet, teams still get surprised by them. Usually, the problem is not the certificate itself. It is ownership. Nobody knows who owns the domain. The renewal process depends on an old mailbox. A certificate was created manually years ago. Or the monitoring only checks the application after the certificate has already expired. Another trap is monitoring only the certificate you think production is serving. There may be a load balancer with one certificate, a CDN with another, an internal service mesh issuing its own certificates, and some forgotten endpoint using something completely different. The useful inventory is not just what certificates exist. It is which endpoint presents which certificate, who renews it, and what happens if renewal fails. That is a much more operational question. The fix is not complicated. Inventory the certificates, know who owns them, automate renewal where possible, alert well before expiration, and test the renewal path before the deadline. Certificate management is one of those areas where boring automation is dramatically better than heroic incident response. Fourth, Cloudflare is experimenting with CI workflows written in TypeScript. The interesting idea is that the workflow itself becomes normal application code. You can define steps, retries, concurrency, and caching behavior in TypeScript instead of expressing everything through a large YAML configuration. There are some obvious advantages. You get normal language constructs, and you can test parts of the workflow more like software. But there is also a trade-off. The more programmable CI becomes, the easier it is for the pipeline to turn into another application nobody really owns. We have all seen YAML pipelines become impossible to reason about. Code can absolutely become impossible to reason about too. There is also a governance question here. One advantage of declarative CI is that the set of things a pipeline can express is intentionally constrained. Once workflows become arbitrary code, you gain flexibility, but you also need stronger conventions around libraries, reviews, dependency management, and security. Otherwise, every team eventually invents its own tiny workflow framework. So, I do not think that the lesson is that YAML is bad and TypeScript is good. The lesson is that CI systems are software systems. They need structure. They need tests. They need clear ownership. They need versioning. And they need enough observability that someone can understand why step 7 retried 4 times and then deployed anyway. If CI is part of your production delivery path, treating the workflow definition like real software makes a lot of sense. Just remember, the real software also comes with maintenance. Quick lightning round. First, Dynatrace is acquiring Arise for about $915 million. That is another sign that AI observability is becoming part of the mainstream observability platform instead of living in a separate niche. Second, AWS open-sourced Dogwood for governing agent tool calls. The interesting part is policy around what an agent can do, when it can do it, and under what conditions. That fits directly with the PleaseFix story. Third, Pulumi 3.258 adds opt-in credential encryption. Small change, but a useful reminder that IAC state and configuration often contain more sensitive material than teams realize. And fourth, one AWS credential breach was reportedly noticed because the bill changed. Unexpected egress charges became the security signal. FinOps data is not just about cost anymore. Sometimes it is telemetry for compromise. The human closer this week comes from a story titled "Mario Saved the EU but Broke My System." The details are pretty fun, but the part I liked is the familiar engineering experience underneath it. A policy or platform decision gets made somewhere far away from the team operating the system. The change may be reasonable. It may even be the right thing to do. But the operational consequences still land on somebody. That somebody is usually an engineer who did not write the policy, did not choose the deadline, and still has to make production work afterward. That happens with regulations, security requirements, browser changes, cloud provider defaults, certificate rules, and internal compliance projects. From the outside, the change can look simple. From the inside, it can touch identity, networking, billing, deployment, observability, and a pile of assumptions nobody documented. I think that is one of the underrated parts of infrastructure work. You spend a lot of time translating decisions made at one layer into consequences at another. And sometimes the hardest part is not technical at all. It is explaining that a change described as one checkbox in a compliance document might actually require 3 teams, a migration plan, downtime coordination, and 6 weeks of testing. That is not engineers being difficult. That is the difference between describing an outcome and implementing it safely. The best platform and infrastructure teams get good at making that translation visible early, not after the deadline, not after the outage, early enough that everyone understands what the change actually costs. And the best engineers are usually the ones who can do that without turning every change into a fight. Understand why the change exists. Figure out where the blast radius actually is. Communicate the trade-offs clearly. And make the transition boring. That is usually the real job. Not preventing change. Making change survivable. That's it for this week of Ship It Weekly. We covered GitHub's outage, the PleaseFix Agentic browser vulnerability, AWS Certificate Manager moving away from email validation, and Cloudflare's TypeScript CI workflows, plus Dynatrace and Arise, AWS Dogwood, Pulumi credential encryption, and an AWS breach detected through unexpected egress costs. Follow or subscribe wherever you are watching or listening. You can find the weekly story list and source links at oncallbrief.com and past episodes and full show notes at shipitweekly.fm. I'm Brian Teller from Teller's Tech. Thanks for listening. And remember, the boring dependency is usually boring right up until it becomes the whole incident.